Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, released back in July of 2019, is Koji Igarashi's very closely hewing spiritual follow-up to his Castlevania games, perhaps most specifically Symphony of the Night and the Sorrow duology, Aria and Dawn of Sorrow. It's an open-world, exploration-based, side-scrolling action platformer with RPG elements in the forms of equipment and level gaining, with progression mostly gated off by ability upgrades, or, as it is known these days, a Metroidvania. But Ritual of the Night finds itself released into a very different gaming world than Symphony of the Night was 22 years ago. Back then, Symphony was a wonderful novelty and breath of fresh air in a newly 3D-obsessed gaming world, a game basically doing Super Metroid that wasn't Metroid, just wasn't a thing then. Hell, even through most of the 00's decade, in the span of 6 Game Boy Advance and DS Castlevania games between Circle of the Moon in 2001 and Order of Ecclesia in 2008, these games were still novelties, something explored really only in the eponymous Metroid and Castlevania series, and Cave Story kind of, and Legacy of the Wizard on NES if you really want to stretch it. But I really remember things changing around 2009 or so when Shadow Complex came out, and the developers just straight up went, "Yep, we love Super Metroid, and we want to make Super Metroid. Super Metroid rules. Super Metroid, Super Metroid, Super Metroid." And since then, the Metroidvania subgenre has gone nuts. So Ritual of the Night finds itself released into a world not where it's a novelty, but where, in addition to all the pre-existing Metroid and Castlevania games, we have Hollow Knight, Axiom Verge, The Messenger, The Mummy Demastered, Blasphemous, Monster Boy, Ori and the Blind Forest, SteamWorld Dig, Time Spinner, Chasm, the Guacamelee games, Iconoclasts, La Mulana, most of the Shantae games, and I'm sure a dozen others besides that I'm forgetting. So, stacked up against this competition, does Ritual of the Night hold up all the same? Well, I'm pleased to say, yeah. If you're the sort of type who needs a cold, hard grade or score to appreciate a game review, I'll just spoil my overall impression and say this game is a rock-solid B+. Very enjoyable start to finish, but definitely not without a few quibbles here and there, and you can go about your day. But if you're still here, good. Let's get a little more into the details. The generic cheeseball dark anime story concerns Miriam, our protagonist playing the de facto Alucard Belmont role, and our villain Jebel playing the de facto Dracula. And by the way, Jebel, that's a clunky ass ugly name, and I can't believe they couldn't come up with something better for our villain. But anyway, Miriam and Jebel are shard binders, beings experimented on as children by alchemists seeking means to summon demons.
Jebel, tell me you didn't do this. It doesn't make any sense.
How does it not? After all the sins humans wrought upon us?
Mana crystals embedded in their flesh, which gives them vast magical powers. All the rest of the Shardbinders were killed, but Jebel, resentful of his childhood torment by humanity, has summoned Castlevania. Summoned a legally non-specific gothic demon castle, which Miriam must explore to bring him down, despite having been wronged by humanity herself. Right away, this calls to mind the dynamic between Terra and Kefka in Final Fantasy VI. Given magical powers via mad scientist shenanigans their pasts, which caused our hero to get a bit amnesiac and a bit depressed, and the other one to break bad. But beyond giving myself a chuckle with that comparison, I would say the plot is generic. Certainly doesn't rise above any DS Castlevania game. There are later game twists, I guess, about Jebel and some other characters and some motivations that I guess were supposed to shock and awe, but I was just kind of like, okay, whatever. But, and this is a notable but, that's actually fine, and I don't count it against the game at all. You see, the older I get, the more, with the possible exception of JRPGs, I find I don't really care about plot in video games. Plot meaning sequence of events. I'll read a novel for that. It's probably why a lot of modern day cinematic games honestly do very little for me. It's like, oh yeah, I see a movie, but not as good. Wonderful. What I do care about very much is atmosphere, tone, aesthetics, and lore. I freely admit it's kind of a bizarre, hypocritical thing with me. Long dialogue cutscenes and whatnot in games usually bore me to tears, but I actually love looking through in-game lore. whether it's largely contextual and unspoken and unexplained in something like Shadow of the Colossus, or just straight up written out descriptions of past events and monster manuals and whatnot. Probably why I love Metroid Prime, the way it presents its story through those scans and codexes and everything. And Bloodstained does a pretty damn good job at all this. The tone and atmosphere is obviously all Castlevania, and I mean all Castlevania. Dark gothic fantasy with no attempt whatsoever to distinguish itself from Castlevania in any way, shape, or form. And the lore is mostly laid out in an unobtrusive way, with a compendium of information about the world and backstory and characters and magic and monsters. You fill out through your journey, finding journals, meeting characters and enemies, and you can look through this compendium at your leisure. I like this, it's well done. Aesthetically, when it comes to just the pure look of the Metroidvania genre, I have to admit that my heart will always lay with pixel art over this sort of sleek, modern 3D look. What can I say? I just love pixel art in general. Always have, always will. My phone home screen has pretty much always been pixel art of some sort or another, going back a decade plus. But that said, as far as this 3D look goes, I would say this is well done. It's colorful, it's moody, the backgrounds are consistently kind of rich and well animated. Areas look distinctive. Even some of the flashier effects, like the camera swinging about as you enter the castle or at the Tower of the Twin Dragons, could have played as gimmicky, but they hold these things back just long enough that it works in the moment and sweeps you up. Some of the animation is a bit incomplete feeling. I'll specifically note the awkward NPC walking animation. And some of the areas such as a lava cave and ice cave are a bit kind of generic video game stuff, but the really Castlevania areas of the game, cathedrals, spooky hallways, sorcery labs, dark villages, and this one treasure area near the top of the castle that made me think of that one gold level in Castlevania 4. This stuff all really works. Michiru Yamane's soundtrack is of course great. Epic and gothic and creepy by turns, with a number of stick-in-your-brain cues. Never expected anything less. If I have a critique, it's that it arguably does put its best foot forward, with most of the strongest themes early on. No really epic backing score as you make your gauntlet to the final boss or anything. In fact, that's probably true of the game as a whole. Great, but putting its best foot forward. In the gameplay department, the earliest sections of the castle, the entryway, the cathedral, the gardens, the machine library, and so on, are consistently the ones that seem to wrap around and into and through each other in thoughtfully designed, interesting and elaborate ways that, as a Metroidvania fan, make you smile and go, well that was clever. But the deeper you get toward the endgame, the more large areas just seem to be kind of self-contained and bolted onto the sides of the main castle with scotch tape. I'm certainly thinking of the aforementioned lava and ice areas here, and the Oriental Sorcery Lab and the Behemoth Lair. I wonder if it was always intended that way, or if they had a time crunch maybe as production went on and couldn't quite perfect the map design. If it's the former, then, well, fine. The same is true of Torian and Super Metroid, I guess. But here it's more than just the one tiny little endgame section like that. It's really about the last third or so of the entire game. But that nitpick aside, if you're a fan of this genre, it's impossible to not start having a good time in a new Metroidvania as you start to explore the game's world, fill in that map, find upgrades and boss encounters in new areas, and of course, a million little points that make you go, I'll need to come back here later. And Ritual of the Night is no exception. For the bulk of my playthrough, as I did just that, filled in that map, I was consistently having a blast. Maybe no genre I enjoy more. Certainly no genre I enjoy studying the game design and creative choices of more. It may not be quite as brilliantly designed a map as Super Metroid. No games are, but I'd have no problem putting Ritual of the Night on a level with previous Castlevanias like a Circle of the Moon or a Portrait of Ruin. But the shard system, where various enemies will give Miriam crystal shards that give you projectile attacks that use your magic points, stat alterations, monster familiars, new abilities, and so on and so forth is lifted extremely directly from Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow's Soul system, which is why even more so than the definitely somewhat more famous and popular Symphony of the Night, I really see this game as a follow-up to that great duology, a third Sorrow game. Ritual of Sorrow, if you will. Now, personally, I did end up really focusing in on a relatively tiny handful of shard abilities I found useful throughout my adventure, rather than experimenting through the course of the game. I had the heretical grinder chainsaw weapon equipped for, 80% of the game, but whether that's my problem or the game's problem or a feature and not a problem at all that's up to you. Difficulty is well balanced, at least coming from someone who played the game on normal difficulty. Miriam controls smooth as butter. Important side note here, after hearing about the input lag on the Switch version, I played the PlayStation 4 version. It may well be that Miriam does not control smooth as butter on the Silk, and I've heard as much, but that's neither here nor there because I didn't play that version. Alright, back to the regularly scheduled review. Her jumps and attack and backdash all feel great. You can definitely die, and I did quite a number of times even at relatively high levels. If you try to bulldoze through the castle, taking hits willy-nilly without a care in the world. A lot of enemies can and will hack away a tenth of your life bar with but a graze, and trust me, you can graze many more than 10 enemies between 2 save points if you're not careful. And a lot of later game bosses can kick your ass too. I had trouble with, but also really enjoyed the fights with the demon hunting samurai Zangetsu, the main character from the prequel game, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon. They felt like real sincere fights, not button mashing sessions, demanding a mix of patience, carefully timed aggression, strategy, and twitch reflexes, just the right equipment and a dose of luck. I was stuck on the second fight for almost an hour. Died a bunch of times. I was frustrated, but it felt so good when I finally beat him. A few later game bosses are underwhelming in presentation though, just slightly larger than usual monsters that lumber toward you in small rooms. Now the early game bosses, like the naked fish lady on the ship and the twin dragons, are so epic in presentation that some later bosses a bit disappointing, don't really measure up. Hell, the fight against the demon Gremory is easily more epic in the 8-bit pixel art spin-off, Curse of the Moon, that I just mentioned. Again, I wonder if they came up against some time crunch later in production. Now, there are some great points in classic Metroidvania fashion where you get a new ability and suddenly the world opens up in a wonderful way. The double jump, that's a classic and obvious one. Don't think I'm spoiling anything saying there's a double jump in a Metroidvania. And also in this game, the ability to turn into a light beam and bounce off walls and through narrow spaces, and even a very clever way to let's say, quote-unquote fly toward the endgame that just cracks the entire map wide open like a great, glorious gothic walnut. Some things you need to progress are hidden in awkward spots though. The Aegis armor, which makes you immune to environmental hazards and you need to get through this corridor of spikes, is just tucked away in this completely arbitrary, no rhyme or reason to it chest in this one corner of one room on the far side of the castle. Like, why don't you get this for beating a boss? Its location would be completely appropriate to hide a health or mana upgrade, but not something you need to beat the game. Similarly, the shard you need to go underwater, again, essential for completing the game, you don't get from a boss like in most previous exploration-based Castlevania games. You get from this 10% chance drop from this little random-ass jellyfish enemy in the bowels of the castle. Why isn't this coughed up by a boss? Again, you must get this shard. I freely admit and have no shame about the fact that I found it by Googling Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night Swimming, and I'm someone who's beaten lots of Metroidvanias without a guide, so I shouldn't have needed to do this. Kinda iffy game design there. Speaking of iffy game design, I thought there was way too much cruft in the village section of the game. You'll end up warping back to a bunch. There's way too many little subquests and stuff, like this lady who wants you to
Kill that murderer dead!
and this guy in his dumb little farm you have to manage, and this lady who wants a list of items to pay tribute to her dead friends, another lady who wants food items, and it's too much. In fact, the entire food crafting system is bizarre. I explored over 98% of the world map in my playthrough, and I think I found the ingredients for a grand total of like 5 or 6 of the dozens of recipes in the game. Why are the foods hidden away so elaborately? That curry sauce is locked up tighter than Knights of the Round materia in Final Fantasy VII. I never found that shit. Ridiculous. I think they could have easily done away with about 85% of the village nonsense subquests and just had the one shop on the left to sell you potions and ethers, and then the weapon crafting shard upgrading station on the right. Just those 2 things, and the game would have been stronger for it. It's all just cruft, man. I didn't need any of it. But I don't want to sound overly negative, because when the game forgoes that cruft and just does its Metroidvania thing, you still see a master of the genre at work. It doesn't gate off areas into standalone levels like Portrait of Ruin or Order of Ecclesia did, and unlike Symphony of the Night, the second half of the game isn't just the first half flipped upside down with the same identical musical track playing over and over and driving you crazy through the entire castle. You're constantly turning up new areas on the satisfyingly huge and enjoyable map, constantly finding cool new weapons and spells, always driven on to try to get a little further and see what you can find next. There is almost always a satisfying answer to every, how do I tackle this, or where do I go next puzzle, all driven forward by strong, dark fantasy aesthetics and a kickin' soundtrack and challenging but fair combat. As we wrap this review up, let's just throw out some other random cool stuff I want to take note of. The way the game does its very understated, well-integrated tutorial section with that self-contained mini Metroidvania map in the Galleon, and just segues that directly into main map, is cool. Now, the little hidden 8-bit area that's like a flashback to an NES Bloodstained 1 that never existed is just cool as all hell, and honestly just about the pinnacle of what a great video game Easter egg should be. The entire Tower of the Twin Dragon section is cool, that swinging camera, the epic music, the epic boss fight, the dynamic between Miriam and Zangetsu and the aforementioned Zangetsu fights are cool. The train section is cool enough that they just pretty much snatched it up directly for the first level of Curse of the Moon. The ability to change Miriam's outfit, hair color, hairstyle, eye color. Doesn't add anything to the gameplay per se, but hey, it's cool, it's in there, why not? Despite my complaints about the gratuitous cruft of the village, the shard upgrading system is cool and makes the game quite adaptable to how you want to play it and what spells and abilities you want to focus in on as a player. Hey, the last boss is cool. A bit of a giant space flea from nowhere, but suitably epic. So yeah, overall, I wouldn't call this the greatest Metroidvania ever. That would still be Super Metroid. Or even the best quote-unquote Castlevania game from Igarashi, which to me personally is probably still Dawn of Sorrow. I really love that one. But is it awesome that it exists, and should you play through it if you're interested in this subgenre? To that I would have to throw out an enthusiastic yes. There's nitpicks, and if you're over the age of 16, you aren't going to be walking away from it telling all your friends about the amazing story or anything, but if you like filling out that dang old map, hunting down bosses and upgrades and doing it to kickin' gothic soundtrack, I can say that you will find Bloodstained Ritual of the Night to be a not miserable little pile of Metroidvania goodness. I definitely see myself playing through it again, once I've played Link's Awakening. Alright, later everyone.